This lecture for History 370, Modern East Asia, will cover Section 8, State Building and War in Asia, 1915 to 1953. I think this is likely to be the most difficult section that we're going to be looking at. Right? This is the longest in a sense. This is the most complex because we're going to be looking at multiple wars, or rather, in a sense, what appear to be multiple wars, but in some ways are closely connected wars that in a few ways actually are continuous with each other, especially if you're coming from a Chinese perspective. So I have some objectives here a little bit more complex than usual to help us understand them. First of all, we need to understand the development of an increasingly unified Chinese state during a time of civil war. So we'll see China is going to go from being basically divided to increasingly unified while simultaneously fighting, right? Especially we're going to see a civil war between nationalists and communists. We'll understand how the increasing power of the nationalist state and other factors led to Japan's seizure of Manchuria and then invasion of China. We will then understand how the war between China and Japan became part of the Second World War, right? So we start off with the Chinese Civil War, it leads to war with Japan, then it leads to World War II, in a sense, and then it leads to a Chinese Civil War in which nationalist China is defeated by the communists. They kind of call time out during World War II, sort of, kind of. We will also understand how Korea became independent, but then divided, and how that division led ultimately to the Korean War. We will also try and understand how the Korean War impacted China and Japan. So this is a difficult and long section. After the fall of Yuan Shikai, China essentially had no effective central government. There was a government, though. It just was not effective, right? So there is a government that says that we are the government of China, and it's recognized by some foreign powers as the government of China. It's centered in Beijing, but it doesn't actually wield effective central power. And that's going to be a problem because that government is going to make deals with foreign countries that can then say, well, we made a deal with the central government, and these deals aren't necessarily in the interests of China as a whole. Basically, the central government is weak and doesn't have any money. So in exchange for loans, it will basically give other countries, especially Japan, influence over Chinese territory. At the same time, during this time period, in the 1910s, there's growing Chinese nationalism as Chinese are having this experience of having a very weak government. And I'll give you some more concrete examples as we go on, but a government that's unable to defend them or Chinese territory. More and more Chinese people say, you know what? We Chinese need to stick together. We need to work together. We need to put China first. So there's growing Chinese nationalism. And this is going to be encouraged by what's going to happen during World War I, particularly the Versailles Treaty. So remember, one thing we have to really stress is that China and Japan are both on the Allied side during World War I. Right? China and Japan both are on the side of the Allies during World War I. They're on the victorious side. Now, neither of them lost anything like the number of people that the Europeans lost. I mean, the Europeans lost millions of people. The Japanese contributed mostly by sending some naval forces to help out in Europe, seizing some German possessions in the Pacific, and remember, seizing Qingdao. Right? Remember, the Japanese are going to seize, remember how we talked about how Qingdao was this area that was under German control, and that helped lead to the Boxer Rebellion? Well, the Japanese will take that from the Germans, right? The Japanese will take that from the Germans. The Chinese, in comparison, their major contribution to the war effort is the sending of laborers, some of whom will die, and this isn't just a few people, it's a couple 100,000 laborers that they're going to send to help dig trenches in France for French and British forces. That's not negligible, but when you compare it to what the Japanese did, it's not quite as much, it wasn't combat, and when you compare it to what the Europeans were doing, it wasn't nearly as bloody, nearly as difficult. But at the same time, Japan and China both expected to be rewarded for what they did. And I think in a certain sense, the Chinese were a little bit overly optimistic about what they thought they would get. But in particular, what China wanted to get Qingdao back, right? During the war, Japan had seized German concessions in China, including Qingdao, and the Chinese said, we would like our land back. We would like our territory back. We leased it to the Germans. The Germans were defeated. We want it back. However, Japan will get to keep that territory. right? Japan will get to keep that territory. They'll get to maintain the lease. They don't keep it forever. But according to the Versailles Treaty, they get to keep it. And there's basically two reasons why. First of all, the British and the French, in order to get Japanese help, had promised the Japanese that they would allow them to keep the territory. So in order to get Japanese help, basically the British and the French give away Chinese territory. So the Chinese are naturally a little bit upset about that. But also, what ends up happening is that the Chinese central government, which is not an effective central government, seems to have given over promises to Japan that they could increase their influence in China, and this gave this a kind of legality, right? So in a sense, the central government, in exchange for support from Japan, basically is going to acquiesce to them taking Qingdao. Said it's fine. So other countries just say, well, look, we're sorry, China, but according to international law, this is all legal. Your official, recognized central government said that this was fine. The Chinese, of course, the Chinese people feel betrayed by their own government, and they also feel disenchanted with Western democracy, right? So they feel betrayed by their own government, which basically sold out their territory to the Japanese, right? They have this government that doesn't protect them, that just gives away their territory in a sense, and can't protect their territory. And they're frustrated, like I said, with their own government, and they feel this kind of disenchantment. You know, these Western people claim to be so civilized, they claim to be so good, but all they care about is this international law stuff that has nothing to do with morality, right? This is our territory. How can it just be taken away from us? How can it be given to someone else? You know, you Western democracies, you claim to believe in civilization and justice and morality, but really you just believe in this kind of law that you can control to beat up on weaker countries. So what this means is that many Chinese people are going to feel like in order for their country to be strong, to be truly independent, they need to undergo deep reform, and maybe reform that doesn't look like that of the Western democracies, right? In the past, many Chinese people like Sun Yat-sen said, we need to be more like, say, the United States, or we need to be more like Great Britain. But more and more, some are saying, we don't want to be like those Westerners. They don't seem that great. And our own government's not that great. So we need to undergo radical change. This belief that radical change was needed in order to fix China leads to what's called the May 4th movement. What's really complex about the May 4th movement is that there's a bunch of different years associated with it. So, for example, the name May 4th refers to the protests carried out by Chinese students in May 4th, 1919, when they learned of the terms of the Versailles Treaty and that their territory at Qingdao was going to be given away, right, to the Japanese. This is something that really frustrates them, makes them very angry, not happy about it, not one bit. Now, what's complex, though, is even though it's called the May 4th, 1919 movement, is it doesn't just last a day, right? It's going to last, by varying counts, from 1919 to 1925. And we'll talk about why 1925 is such an important year later on. But then some people argue actually it begins way back in 1915 with the publication of a journal called New Youth, which we will talk about later. And the idea of that date is it emphasizes that this wasn't just something that happened overnight, but rather that students were becoming increasingly radicalized, and this movement on May 4th, 1919 just crystallized that. And I think that's a little bit complex, but remember, I'm not going to ask you for exact years in this course. So I just want to highlight those years so we understand that there's problems that Chinese people realize, especially students realize this, because students are often the people who are meeting the most recent scholarship or learning the most recent information. So they realize something is up first among many Chinese people. But this, like I said, takes time. There's, like I said, this journal we'll talk about later, the New Youth starts in 1915. These students are reading it and its radical ideas. And suddenly on May 4th, 1919, those radical ideas make a lot of sense. And this will lead the students to launch these massive protests. And this movement will characterize the next 6 years until about 1925, right? And it's in 1925 that, again, we're going to see another crystallization. We're going to move from students being upset to much more concrete action. So one thing to think about May 4th movement, there's protests and things like that, but this is primarily an intellectual movement, right? This is primarily an intellectual movement, which will later provide the foundations for the movement to help unify China. So the May 4th movement is this kind of intellectual foundation that will help lead later on, particularly after what happens in 1925, to the unification of China, at least somewhat. So there's all these student protests, and the Chinese delegation actually will refuse to sign the Versailles Treaty, right? They'll say this treaty is unfair to us, this is wrong, we refuse to sign it. And this encourages students even more. The students on one side are horrified at the weakness of China. They say, oh my gosh, this is terrible. Our territory has been just given away to someone else, and there's nothing we can do about it. But also they realize that their government does refuse to sign, and that in part this was impacted by their own actions, right? They were able to pressure the government to do something. So on one side, the students are horrified about how weak China is, but they're also hopeful because they see that they can do something, right? So there's a kind of fear, but it's not the fear that paralyzes. It's the fear that inspires Chinese students in particular, but also intellectuals and other people as well, that they can bring change, right? So there's this, in a sense, positive reaction to this weakness. Chinese people are becoming more nationalistic. They feel more and more the difficult situation their country is in, and that it impacts them personally, but they're inspired to do something about it. And basically, the goal of the May 4th movement is strengthening the nation state through radical reform of society and Chinese civilization, right? We're going to go back to basics. We have to completely review and revise and, in a sense, revolutionize our culture and our civilization because, darn it, we keep losing, right? We've been trying this for decades now. We've been trying to get things together and we keep losing. And so the solution must be something really deep. We have to really bring massive, massive changes. And what's shocking in a sense is they were trying in the sense to be like Japan previously, to have a Meiji restoration, which was in many ways radical. But now the Meiji restoration looks kind of conservative, especially when we look at some of the very radical ideas the Chinese are going to have. For example, the Meiji restoration restored an emperor, held out liberal democracy as the ideal. We're going to see that's going to be comparatively conservative to what these May 4th movement people want to do. In my opinion, there are really two figures that encapsulate the May 4th movement. The first of them has to be one of my favorite authors, a man named Lu Xun. As a young man, he left home for Shanghai because he knew that something was going on, that China was getting weaker, and he knew that Shanghai was a place where he could meet Western people, where he could see what it meant to be modern. And it went even beyond what he imagined. The electric lights, the automobiles, the modern buildings, the trains, electricity, everything he saw there just really amazed him. And at the same time, he was ashamed because he could see just how far ahead the West was and how weak China was, right? The Westerners could just come here to China and build all this, and there weren't really anything the Chinese could do about it. And there's a kind of colonial modernity here, right? Remember how we talked about with the Koreans, where the modern was associated with the people who were, in a sense, oppressing them, right? The frustration here is the people who are beating up on us, who are so much more powerful than us, they're the people that we're supposed to be like, that we're supposed to imitate, and that's kind of frustrating. Lu Xun decided that he wanted to get more knowledge, to gain more of this Western knowledge, and so he went to study medicine in Japan, right? He went to study medicine in Japan. Seemed like a very practical way to gain knowledge that would help Chinese people. While he was in Japan, he was one of only a few Chinese in his class, and one day they got together during the Russo-Japanese War to watch like a slideshow. So basically what happened was people would take photographs of what was happening in the Russo-Japanese War and then send those pictures to Japan, and then people would get together and they would project the pictures. It was kind of, like I said, a slideshow onto like a screen, and people would look at it and they would have narration. And one thing that really bothered him was that one of the slides was of Japanese soldiers executing a Chinese person that they had accused of being a spy. And what really bothered Lu Xun was not so much that the Chinese person was being executed, but by how the Chinese people in the picture were reacting. They were watching foreigners execute one of their own people, and their faces were blank, were expressionless, as if they didn't realize that this represented a serious crisis, that foreigners could just come onto Chinese territory. Remember, Manchuria is claimed by China, and arrest Chinese and then execute them. And it didn't seem to bother them at all. And Lu Xun said, you know what? I need to wake up the people. I need to wake up China and the Chinese people to the danger of their situation. And he literally uses this metaphor of being asleep and needing to be woken up. So he talks about how like the Chinese people are like people stuck inside an iron box that's been locked, and they're in danger of suffocating. And he's going to pound on the iron box. He's going to pound on that box in hopes to wake them up. They may still suffocate. They may wake up and not be able to get out of the box, and they'll die. But at least they know what was happening to them. If he's successful in waking up and they get out, wonderful. But both of those things are better than just suffocating while still asleep. So he wants to wake up the Chinese people and get them to be aware of their situation in hopes that they will do something, right? In hopes that they will do something. And so he will become a writer, right? He's going to become a writer. And so I really want to stress the May 4th movement, in a sense, is this intellectual movement in which you're going to be building a foundation for later on a kind of development in China, the beginnings of a unification. So what then did Lu Xun write about? Well, he wrote about Chinese people in a sarcastic and cynical way. His work was satire, so it was often humorous, but it was a kind of dark humor, one that was meant to reveal the, in a sense, hypocrisy, the corruption in Chinese culture, in Chinese civilization. And he wrote a lot of very interesting stories. They tended to be short stories. One of the, I think the most interesting, one of my favorites, is the true story of Ah Q, right? And Ah Q is there on the left, and he's the man on the right who is wearing traditional style Chinese clothing, looking down on what he called the imitation foreign devil. And the true story of Ah Q follows the life of this very, very poor Chinese laborer, a man who doesn't really own even his own land, who has very little wealth. What money he has, he gambles away. And the poor guy is just a tremendous loser. He's constantly losing. And at one point, he finds solace by saying, well, you know what? I'm the best loser. No one loses as much as I do. No one loses as well as I do. And it's absurd, but what Lu Xun is trying to say is this is the Chinese character. Rather than looking at our defeats, looking at our losses and saying, I need to change, we end up being proud of ourselves for being losers. So we need to change, right? So he's really looking deeply and saying there's something wrong with us Chinese people. There is something deeply, deeply wrong with us. And what ends up happening is Ah Q pretends to join the revolution. He doesn't actually, and I'm talking about the revolution of 1911, 1912. He doesn't understand what the revolution is. He just thinks it's a way to get rich and powerful. It fails, and he ends up being executed as a revolutionary, even though he has no idea what a revolution actually is, and just pretended to be in the revolution to try and become powerful. Like it's this really bizarre situation. But the idea is that Ah Q stands for the Chinese people. They've had a revolution, but they have fundamentally stayed the same, right? They still don't understand what's going on. And the key thing is through Ah Q, Lu Xun is saying, we Chinese need to change, and our revolution is incomplete. We had a political revolution, a revolution that got rid of an old government, but because there's something deeply wrong with Chinese civilization, with Chinese culture as seen by Ah Q, and all the other characters, everyone has a problem. He doesn't just pick on poor Ah Q. But it's seen by this, because we're so rotten, we couldn't find anything to replace that government. So in a sense, we had a political revolution. We got rid of an old government that was not doing a good job, but we have not had the deeper, more radical revolution that will go through society, that will go through our Chinese civilization. And that's what we need to do. And Lu Xun was a very popular author because he gave these messages in this very clever way. And like I say, I love his stories because they're very funny. And being a historian, I tend to be a bit of a cynic. Lu Xun was a cynic, so we get along just fine. Now, I think you could very reasonably say, well, that's great. You're making fun of China. You're saying that we need to change, we need to transform, but what are we going to do? And this is fundamentally one of the problems with Lu Xun, is he was not very clear about what China needed to do. He was essentially a social critic who could hold up a mirror to China and say, look at your problems, China. You have all these issues. But he wasn't a constructive person in a sense, right? He was destructive. He was able to, through his satire, to criticize the traditional Chinese way of doing things and saying, we need to do things differently. But he was not really able to bring positive change or come up with a vision for what needed to be done. So he could do the destructive work. But someone else needs to do the constructive work. Someone needs to think about how, once we've, in a sense, torn down the old China, how are we going to build a new China? And you may recall that I had just explained how the May 4th movement is connected, if you want to push it back to the year 1915, to this journal, New Youth. New. That's kind of the refrain of the May 4th movement. We need a new culture, a new China, a new civilization, a new youth, a new everything. And the man who founded the New Youth was named Chen Duxiu. And Chen Duxiu is a fascinating person. He was a great admirer of France, and especially radical French social thinkers and political thinkers. So he's not interested in liberal democracy. That's conservative now. Trying to be like the United States or Great Britain, that's conservative. He wants to build something much more radical, something in line with these French socialists who don't just think about reconstructing politics, don't just think of the political question, but who also think of the social question, right? He's very interested in that issue in particular. So that's something we have to keep in mind here. Now, Chen Duxiu was very much against Confucian virtues. He thought the Confucian virtues were terrible. He argued, similar in some ways to Lu Xun, that Confucian virtues, idea of deference, of benevolence, of loyalty, of filial piety, these so-called virtues had kept Chinese people prisoners, right? They had respected authority too much. Ideas of filial piety allow the old to dominate the young. And because of this, China was too conservative. So they need to get rid of Confucianism. Confucianism was all about order and control. China needed dynamism. China needed change. So it was against Confucian virtues. And like Lu Xun, Chen Duxiu said the problem of the 1911 revolution was it did not go far enough. It was only a political revolution, right? It was only a political revolution. We need something more, right? We need something more. And it's interesting because he comes up with this argument that what we need is Mr. Democracy and Mr. Science. We need to base our country and our government and our society around democracy and around science, right? Now you may say to yourself, well, wait a second. I thought democracy was a Western idea connected to liberal democracies like the United States and Great Britain. And didn't you just say that the Chinese now, these radical thinkers such as Chen Duxiu, don't want to be like the United States and Great Britain? And you're exactly right. That's a very good question to ask. And here's my answer. He meant something else by democracy, right? Increasingly people, radicals, will look at places like the United States, like Great Britain, and even like France and say, look, democracy is a sham. The poor don't really get to make their voices heard. Democracy is all about the rich controlling politics. Basically, democracy is the best government money can buy, right? Democracies are run by rich people for rich people. And so he's not interested in, say, like what Sun Yat-sen was thinking of, basically trying to establish a kind of Christian-inspired republic. Instead, Chen Duxiu will help found the Communist Party, right? He's going to help found the Chinese Communist Party, which claims to be both democratic and scientific, right? Communism claimed to be democratic because it would do the will of the people. Capitalist liberal democracies tend to say, well, the will of the people is known through voting, but communism would argue that that's not true democracy, that the will of the people is not made known, only the will of the rich. So like I said, they mean something else by democracy. And also communism will claim to be scientific. So Chen Duxiu's belief in democracy and science will lead him to embrace communism and actually help found the Chinese Communist Party.